Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Tom Lipkin. I am the head of new ventures at the UCLA Technology Development Group, or TDG. We are the tech transfer office for UCLA. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of our Spring New Ventures Entrepreneurship Bootcamp. This is a lecture series that is meant to provide insight and information for those of you with startup companies, as well as those of you in the community that are thinking about starting up a company. I am very pleased to have Manny Stockman from OUP kick off our series. And if you are interested in finding out our full agenda, it is shown here. You can also go to our website, which is tdg.ucla.edu, to get not only the agenda for the bootcamp, but also more information about our office and ongoings at UCLA. At the bottom, while you're there and looking around, I encourage you to also sign up for our newsletter so we can get more information to you in your inboxes. So today's talk from Manny, I just want to give a little bit of background on OUP. They are a Philadelphia-based venture fund that invests in university-based startup companies. So they have a partnership with 100+ institutions, and they source opportunities from those academic centers. They invest early through late stage, and in terms of sector, very, very broad. So software, hardware, therapeutics, diagnostics, and medical devices. We're thrilled to have Manny come and talk to us today about a topic that we at New Ventures get asked quite a bit, and that is on founders equity. The title of this talk is Founders Equity Formation, Dilution, and Industry Averages. Before I turn it over to Manny, we wanted to make this as dynamic and interactive as possible. So if you do have questions, please write them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Manny, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Let me share my screen. Make sure I do it correctly. I just switched to a Mac, so I don't know what kind of trouble I'm going to get myself into. So do you all see my PowerPoint, I hope? Let's see if that works.
Yes, yes, we do.
All right, great. Great. Well, thank you everyone for having me. And I think this is a fun thing to call a boot camp. I don't know if it's going to be quite as intense as a normal one, but it's meant to be a really informal conversation where I hope we can be helpful to you all thinking out some of the problems that come up and excitement that comes up as you're forming a company out of a university. That the tech transfer offices are great places to go to at UCLA to just sort of get the lay of the land and understand the process. It's always tricky when you're first starting a company, and it's oftentimes surprising to me when I do talk to faculty and grad students that they aren't all aware of the resources that just sit right inside the university. And so Tom and his colleagues can be some of the most useful advice you can get. And we're always happy at OUP to also join the discussion at any time. So feel free to email me or ask Tom for my email, or Tom can set up a meeting. But I really want this call to be about the early stages of a company and some of the things that Tom thought would be interesting for us to talk to you all about. And but feel free to ask questions throughout. So as Tom described, just a quick intro on OUP. We are a venture fund, and we're based in Philadelphia because the whole idea started along some ideas out of University of Pennsylvania. And since 2008, when we first started, we've now spanned 100 universities that we work with to invest in their startups. And they actually share in some of the financial success of our fund. So we hope that goes back into stimulating more resources for the university and talks like this and curriculum. And some even have incubators and accelerators where they can bring resources to the company. And this talk was formulated out of of the many discussions that we have with university tech transfer offices, one of the ones that most often comes up is, how do you form a company correctly so that it's set up to raise a strong round? And how do you decide what the right allocation of equity is for this company? Along with some other kind of discussions of what to focus on at the earliest days to make sure everyone is lined up for success and being rewarded for the hard work they're about to put into the company. So briefly on me, I've been at OUP now for about 5.5 years. I tend to focus on a lot of our physical sciences and software investments with a slight bent for like the deep tech side of things, just given my background. I was at Lockheed Martin for about 8 years after my PhD. And I think you'll find that our fund is very generalist, as Tom described it. And we're always open to discussions to think about what you're considering building a company around, and sharing some of the lessons learned that I may have observed after tracking now hundreds of companies, maybe 1,000 I've spoken to in 5 years. It's kind of hard to gauge, but especially during COVID, it's just been endless meetings. So founders equity, this is a very interesting discussion that we often have, and we've given this talk at a few universities, and some of the talks get recorded and put on YouTube, and I'll get random calls from entrepreneurs or researchers that say, hey, you gave this talk, and explain to me this part of it, because they don't really fully appreciate the dynamics of distributing equity and how it's all decided. And so this is by no means meant to be a set of rules for everyone to follow, but just more guidelines and industry averages, as Tom liked to describe it, of what would be way abnormal. And so I thought I'd start by just laying the groundwork. I'm not certain what everyone's familiarity is with the terms of venture capital, but as you raise a startup, you will own a piece of equity in that company. As you start a company, you're going to own a piece of equity in that company as a founder or as an early employee. And how much of that company you own when it's bought, let's say a decade later, depends on how much dilution that you take in. And dilution is when other outside groups buy a piece of your company. And so the basic terms of when an investor buys a piece of your company are that you've asked for and they've given you a certain amount of investment. And that's thought of as the round size, how much capital you're bringing in. And the question is, how much does that buy you? How much does that buy the investor? And typically when they do that, they're setting a pre-money valuation for the company. That's what your company is worth today. And the post-money is the amount you're raising plus the amount that you were worth before the money went in. And the amount, the percentage of the company they're buying is pretty simple. It's the amount that they've put into the company divided by the post-money valuation. And so those are the things, the quick calculus that I'm sure you all can do in an instant. I've gotten less good at it since I left the engineering world, but that's a very simple description of what pre-money and post-money are. And when you get into things like preferred stock and common stock, it's good making sure you understand those terms. Preferred stock is what investors buy, almost always. There's some trends going on in the industry where people are investing and buying common stock, and they do that to get on the same playing field of the common stockholders. And the common stockholders are typically the founders of the company and employees who are given shares in the company. And the main reason it's different is that preferred shareholders have preferred rights in the company, and it's typically most important in how the exit event is paid out to shareholders. And I'll go into that later, but just remember there's a difference between them. And almost all investors today are looking for preferred shares. It's 99% of the transactions that go on. Although sometimes investors are buying common shares in a company in what's called a secondary transaction. So, all of these terms and all the other financial mechanisms that can go into a company when it's raising capital, I could talk about for days, but everyone who's raising around or thinking of starting a company should also read a great book by Brad Feld called Venture Deals. It's just a short and simple book that goes through all the different ways that that companies are given investment and all the different gotchas. So, and Tom, I see there's a Q&A. I can look at it, or you can just interrupt me over time to bring it in. Someone asked, how's OUP different than other early stage VCs? I don't think we're that different, other than we are solely focused on startups that spin out of university and grad student research. And so we share our carry with the university, so that's different. And we're also very patient investors, and we invest across the long run. So sometimes we're the first money in, sometimes we're a Series C check for the first time. And that's because university startups I've seen take a long time to develop, and it's not always the best time to invest at the first fundraising round. And it's hard to pass on companies at that stage because we do want to maintain a good relationship, and that's the art of my job, is building good relationships even when I'm not investing. And but at the same time, we're around longer than most other investors. We'll look at your Series C round even though we've passed on the seed and the Series A and the Series B. And our current fund's about 275 million. We've had a couple similarly sized ones before that. Just to, if you do read Brad Feld's book, Venture Deals, they'll go through all of this. And it's the key things to pay attention to are some of these terms. And participating preferred are ways that investors can get more money out before the common shareholders and before other investors. And cap deals are typically relevant to how a maximum amount of money that they can extract given some of the participating preferred relationships. And the traditional approach in the past several years is what's called a non-participating preferred, which is a little more palatable. So it all, just math you should be doing anytime you're raising capital. It's probably not, it's too early in this talk to really dive into this, but it's just something to keep in mind. These are ways, honestly, that investors can play with numbers to, let's say, raise a valuation, but still get a strong payout in the end. So, think of the earliest days of your company. This is, day -10, and you're discussing with your co-founders how much of the company should be distributed to each of the people that are involved. And it's very simple in my mind how to think about it. And you really want to be rewarding for past performance and incentivizing future performance. And so when you have, let's say, a mix of faculty and 2 grad students that want to start a company, the past performance should be accounting for the research that went into that. And in that side of the fence, oftentimes faculty have been putting their life's work into the research that led to the graduate students' last 5 years of research. So there's some balance that's in favor of the faculty members involved. And you really want to think about the contributions on that end. However, on the future performing side, faculty members are not always going to be, working for the company full time, or they may be working for the company full time, but it's not necessarily they're not going to leave the university for the next 2 years. And so you really want to think of incentivizing future performance. And I really do think that future performance side is underappreciated in the spinouts that I've seen, where they don't quite realize just how different starting a company is from running a lab, doing the research at a university. So in what we look at, we're oftentimes focused on who's involved in the company in the long run, but we do always fully appreciate that a ton of work went into the company beforehand. And it's not just, blood, sweat, and tears research. It's the people involved and how their network is. What are they going to bring to the company going forward? And what kind of value are they going to have in the long run? So when you are starting a company, when you do have your co-founders and you're thinking of building this startup, there's a basic way to think about it. First off, you need to split up the company, but still reserve roughly 20% for options. And options are what you do, I'll get into this later, to hire new employees, your first 5 employees, but really every employee. And the reason why it's such a large chunk is because when you're bringing in your first engineer or your first couple hires, you're not going to be able to pay them much. And you really do use options as a way to attract them into the company. But focusing on the other two buckets, these 40% buckets, I really want to stress the importance of a CEO. And not all companies can get the CEO at the earliest, this like great CEO and at the founding of the company. In fact, it's really hard. So that 40% is there if you do find that person. And sometimes we do see in university spinouts, but it's also there for the key founder who's really driving everything forward. And it's very rare we see 3 or 4 founders who are each contributing equally to the company, that are each exceptional fundraisers, that are all have the same qualities, that in the long run will have the same value. And there really are a few important things that we look to in a company. Is there really a single point of contact? Is there really a decision maker? And if that's there, then that decision maker does deserve a significant portion of the company, because they're the ones that are going to be working 200%. They're the ones going to be responsible for engaging with the people that are going to be giving funds to the company. And when someone just asked, what's a good percentage for a CEO who is external? It's a tough question, because oftentimes, around universities, there are CEOs hunting. There's people hunting for their next CEO position, and they're not always the best quality. If you do have someone that's of high quality, let's say if you had your Steve Jobs at the founding of the company, that person would undoubtedly deserve a significant portion of your company. And I'm thinking 40%. And if it's more of a business person who, recent MBA, it's much less. And that's because that person probably doesn't have the long running chops to be the CEO. But if there is some feel that they're going to be, the driver of your fundraise, or they have some staying power for a couple of years, then it's sort of on par with the equity of the technical founders. So I really want to talk about that 40% in the dark green. As for a high quality person, you should be willing to give them a lot of your company, and then everyone else fits into that 40% bucket. These aren't hard numbers, but it is a rule of thumb. And the reason where this is coming from is from data, right? So this is we've been investing in university startups for a very long time, and after hearing a lot about this issue and obviously technical founders wanting to understand the right equity allocation from a data perspective, we said, why don't we just go into our portfolio and pull out the data from the companies we've invested in? So there's bias there. This is what we like to see. It's the equity breakup in the companies that we like to see. And so we surveyed them. So I think we took 20 of our portfolio companies, and it's a little bit messy because not every company has the same number of academic founders, but we do have all academic spinouts. And the breakdown is as we expected. So for, let's say, the blue dots, which are 2 founders, there was one that had 60%, one that had 90% for the founding CEO. When you have 3 or 4 founders, the averages are around 30 to 50% for the founding CEO. And the clear message to take away here is that it's not equal. And so it's hard to really say when you have 3 people and one of them is a professor that they deserve this and this percentage. And it's just, every situation is different, but I do want to just clearly message that it's not equal. And it sets up the company for success later when, if things were equal and the contributions end up having predictably not been equal in the long run, that people are not feeling bent. And so I'm happy to always talk about this. And I've actually wanted to refresh this data just since our company portfolio has grown, and just to get more data behind it. And the mantra you should always be using is reward for past success and incentivize future success. And so as you think about that, I've also kind of curated the data in a way that's a little more fine-grained. And so I stick to that concept of the founding CEO, which could be a researcher, it could be a professor, it could be a graduate student. It's the person that's really going to be putting in, front and center, technical work, fundraising work, business work, HR work for a couple of years, as someone that deserves an unequally large portion of the company. But the most complicated section ends up being where faculty are involved. And and they aren't necessarily fully committed. And so I did create two buckets in this analysis where we were looking at active founding professors and passive founding professors. And passive is probably a strange word to use because they're very passionate, and it's not as if they're just letting things happen, but their commitment isn't full-time. And in the active professor or founding scientist that's involved, they're in the company. Like, they're in fundraising meetings, they're making CTO decisions, they're managing people in many ways. Sometimes they are part-time, to the extent that any faculty is part-time. So 50% of a faculty's time is probably still 50 hours or 40 hours a week or so. But it's a full commitment. Some of them are taking 1 or 2 years off to be a part of this, founding role in the company. And they're typically getting around 20 to 25% of the company. It's not a hard bound, but it's significant. It's a real portion of a company. And if we saw anyone on a cap table with 20 to 25%, we would want to understand who that person is and what they're bringing to the company. And we do that. I'll get into that in a little bit. But when we invest in a company, we're always looking at the cap table to make sure we understand who owns what. The passive founding scientist that I referred to earlier is someone that brings a lot of value to the company. They brought some of the technology in. They have continued guidance that they'll be advising the company on about technical decisions, IP issues, and sometimes even connections to commercial opportunities. But they're not fully taking time off to be a part of the company. And that's, it's really an important role. And we actually often do talk to the advisors, the founding scientists in the company that aren't full-time, to hear what they think about the work that the company is doing. But the equity setup is really only between 1 to 5% or so. Sometimes that can increase if that faculty professor brings a lot of street cachet to the company, where just their brand and their name raise attention to what the company is doing, or if they've raised a ton of capital before in previous startups. But we really like to think of it in that type of slot of 1 to 5%. And then oftentimes, depending on how much the university's been involved in the founding of a company, they're on the cap table as well. And so we've seen all sorts of numbers in this range from 2 to 20%. And we think that that's part of what's great about the university ecosystem is all the resources that they put into the development of technology and the professors, research group startup packages, and the indirect costs of running, keeping the lights on. They are part of the upside. And so we've seen a range, and it depends on the number of resources that the university has brought to the company. And after you kind of set up the fundraising or set up the company at the founding, there's also lots of other hires you have to make. And the most important is this CEO that may or may not be there. Let's say when you're raising your Series A. And when you do bring in that CEO, they need a sizable portion of the company. So if it's like a true Series A, Series B CEO, think of giving them, after you've raised some capital, so none of the numbers above really match anymore because you've been diluted. I'll go into that a little bit. But you need to carve out 5 to 10% or more for that CEO to join, to incentivize them, because if they're coming from a previous successful stint in the corporate world or elsewhere where they're making several $100,000, you're not going to pay them that, and you need to compensate them with equity. And then other C-level hires, a COO, a CFO would be getting a couple percent of your company, and then the engineers and other talent you bring into the company would be in that sort of, let's call it the 1% bucket. And there's a lot of resources on the internet for these types of distributions, but if you ever want a deeper discussion on it, I'm happy to jump on a call. So if there's any questions there, I'll keep going.
Actually, Manny, I did have a question. OUP invests across many different sectors and stages. And I guess at the earliest stages, when you're looking at cap tables, are there any differences or variances based on sector for the equity distributions? Like, are you seeing something different in software versus life sciences or hardware?
Yeah, and I'll comment primarily on like physical sciences, which include software for me, and life science. So in the physical sciences where I live, like, we need the teams to be involved. Like, you can't just take a patent, license it out to some company with business entrepreneurs and expect them to be able to commercialize it. And so the cap tables often are full of the inventors of the IP. And they have a sizable portion of the company because they're also going to be doing the future work at the company. So rarely are we investing in companies where the founding scientists are not key employees in the company. In the life sciences side, particularly in therapeutics, where our life science team is very active, it's actually really rare that the foundational IP from the university, the inventors of that are full-time hires of the company and staffing the key people. And so oftentimes in the life science world, we see some of the more passive founding scientists on the cap table where they have a couple percent in the company. I haven't dived as deeply on that, but that's a clear difference between hardware and software. I've seen it all, so I don't think there's a big difference in my mind. So if you don't get it right, it's an issue. So if you don't allot the right equity to the team at the founding, there ends up being a lot of just ill will across the board. So once you grant equity, it's really hard to take it back. I'll get into this later, but I'll harp on it here. All equity should be vested. So whether you're a founder or a first employee, there should be vesting on your ownership. So even though you may have been a founder of the company, there needs to be some way to set up the schedule so that your founder shares aren't immediately vested on day one. And lawyers know exactly what to do here, and it's very common. And so, that's one aspect of it. But if you don't have the right allotment of it, you can't take it back. And so you really do want to make sure it's done right. And if you have someone that's parasitic on the cap table, what that means is, when you need to hire people, you don't necessarily have enough in your option pool to do so, or you're taking options out of your option pool to hire an employee who you thought the founder, whose role you thought the founder was going to be doing. And so it really gets to be frustrating for the team. And as I'll go into later, when you need to create more options to award new employees or incentivize existing employees, you dilute yourself and you dilute everyone. You can't specifically dilute any one person on a cap table. You just dilute the whole company. And the issue with this at the bottom is the only way to get around it is to recapitalize the company. So if you want to remove a shareholder, you have to drive the value of the company effectively to zero and re-award stock. And that punishes a lot of people unfairly, and it's just messy. And so oftentimes, you remember, like, venture investors, our mission in talking to a company is to get to know. We talk to hundreds of companies and we're just looking for an excuse to not do a deal. And so when you have decisions that were made poorly, especially if it came from an uninformed position, if you didn't do your homework in building the equity of your company, then it's just one flag that we would be raising to ourselves on the team. And so we oftentimes are looking for reasons to say no, and bad equity distribution is one of them. However, Tom asked me before the call, do you walk away from a deal because of this, because of unfair equity distribution amongst the founders? I'd say it's weird, but we haven't, but also we haven't found ourselves getting really excited about teams that haven't haven't already figured it out. And so it's biased, and sometimes in a way, like, the teams we're investing in are the ones that don't make these mistakes. And so, just in short, like, we don't like to recap companies just to solve this equity problem. But if the deal is exciting enough, we might. It's just, you should have this figured out. I think I answered one of the questions that just came in about recapping.
And Manny, just to jump in, the part of that conversation as well was you have to think about the co-investors in that syndicate as well, right? You don't want, you want to build a relationship and partnership with them for the long term as well. So you don't want to have a hard conversation where you're recapping a company and minimizing their equity and contribution as well, right?
Yeah, totally, absolutely. And because once again, a recap affects everyone, anyone who's putting money in the company already. And sometimes in the earliest days of a company after founding, you may be getting angel investors who come in all different sorts, friends and family investors who I would, as an institutional investor, I would not want to crush their stock in a recapitalization. And so those are some of the issues. Just reading a question about retracting shares. Sometimes shares, when employees depart a company, and so the question is, have you ever seen a company divest shares or retract shares? I may be thinking of this incorrectly. My instinct is no, except for this situation, which may be interpreted as a divesting of shares or a retracting of shares. If an employee or a founder leaves and they haven't fully vested, those shares come back. If an employee leaves and they have vested their options, but they don't want to buy those options, so you have a certain period of time after you leave a company to exercise your options, which actually takes money. And so, but those shares aren't worth anything because the company's private. So sometimes a company's, a person's option shares could be worth $500,000, $1 million, and they can't lay out the cash to buy those shares. And if they don't, they can try and sell them to someone who would. But if they can't do that, then the shares go back to the company. So that happens. I hope that answers your question. So the same concepts apply to bad investors. I mean, if investors have bought a share of your company that is way too large, given where you are, then that can be an issue too. So if you've underpriced yourselves in the previous round, that could be an issue. But really, it comes more into the control aspect of things. So if a previous investor owns too much of a company, then oftentimes they have the pro rata rights to invest a certain amount of any round that's raised. And if they have the control so that can't be changed, then let's say they own 20%, 30, 40% of your company and you're raising $10 million, they can, by their pro rata rights, invest 4 of those 10. And some investors, especially those in the Bay Area, like they want to put in 90% of a round. And so if they can't, they don't bother. And so those are the types of issues that can pop up. And as Tom was saying, it's not good practice to recap a company when you have an investor that you may want to work with in the future. And so sometimes it happens, and recaps definitely happen, but it's always a sensitive subject. But more importantly, it's about the team. Like what investors are you working with, and then do they have the right culture to help you build the company, and are they aligned with your incentives that you want to build? Do they have more of a near-term exit than a long-term exit horizon? And so those are the types of things you want to think about when you are bringing in a new investor into your company. And particularly at the angel and pre-seed level, there's a lot of terms that you should watch out for. Particularly on liquidation preferences that I mentioned before, but also rights of first refusal, which deal with pro rata rights, and then voting thresholds, where any terms that get put into, you should think of any terms that you accept in a round as the precedent for all future rounds. And so if you have a 2x liquidation preference at your seed round, then you should expect that any investor thereafter is going to want the same thing. And sometimes that is very, very detrimental to the future of a company. So always watch out for terms that may stick around for the long run. And read Venture Deals by Brad Feld. That's the last time I'll mention it. So as we were discussing founders' equity and ultimately, hopefully, it gets negotiated well amongst the founders, and it really should be a negotiation. Everyone may come out of it thinking they got less than they wanted, and that's unfortunate. But what really should be the focus of the company is creating less dilution over time, because ultimately your success is going to be mostly impacted by how much value you can create as a company and how much you can be bought for or go public for. And the way that you think about your company is raising dollars over time, raising fundraising rounds over time, and value creation. And what value creation means fundamentally is, here on the left at your seed round, you want to raise $1 million, and you're going to raise that at a certain valuation. Let's call this $4 million pre, and so the post of this round is $5 million. So my $1 million as an investor has bought 20% of the company here in the dark gray. And value creation is taking the $1 million that was invested into your company and raising your next round not at a $5 million pre-money valuation, but at a $10 million pre-money valuation. You turn $1 million into $5 million of value creation. And the bigger multiplier you can put on that value creation, the less dilution you'll take over time. That's why you wouldn't necessarily raise the entire 41 million on day one. You want to raise the 41 million over time so that you can put it into buckets. Take 1, turn it into 5. Take 5, turn it into 30. Take 15, turn it into 60. You know, that's how you prevent dilution in your company. How you offset dilution is by focusing on driving value into the company and focusing on what matters. And so for the people that are actively employed at the company, the founders, the CEO, the CTO, the people that are working 80 hours a week, it's about executing commercial contracts, pilots, and technology milestones. For some of the groups that are involved, the investors, the faculty that are back at the university, it's about doing things on the fringes, connecting people in the network to the company to create customer contracts, or identifying key recruiting hires that you can help the company with. So those are the things to be thinking about that will increase the size of your pie ultimately in the end, so that whatever ownership you start with in the beginning in this bottom green area and yellow area is worth more at the end of the company's life. So this is just a quick stat. Average successful startup in our database raised 40 million across about 4 rounds of funding and an exit for 240 million. This is a successful startup. So very rarely do we see companies that are worth a lot that haven't had to raise a lot. And those numbers are growing. Like the amount of capital being put into startups nowadays, especially deep technology startups, is hundreds of millions of dollars. And so you really should be focused on value creation and not just your pure ownership at the beginning. Any questions there? So I touched on this a little bit, and I think we're already at 3:40. Wow. So when you think of what you can do back at the university as a scientific founder, when you're not actively involved in the day-to-day of the company, it's really important to help the company stay up to the state of the art. Bring in valuable technology contributions. Oftentimes, startups are so focused on their product they forget about the next generation of product and their catalogs of technology that they need to have to build an enduring company. And in the best case, you can actually join the company every so often. We've seen professors do sabbaticals every year and a half or so. Sometimes they're leaves of absence to join the company and show enduring value in their contributions. So it's a variety of ways to contribute, and all of them have been, when the professors are very involved in the companies we've invested in, it's been a really helpful collaboration. So now I wanted to go into options a little bit. And these are sort of separate from founder shares, but options are what you give to employees to incentivize them to join your company. And the reason why they're important is, this is something my colleague put together that's kind of funny, I think, is just how much money Google pays their employees. And it's across all categories, right? Not just software. They're hiring great quantum computing talent, great optics talent, great networking talent. It's amazing what they're able to pay their employees because of just how much money they make off of something as simple as search. And options are your way of doing that. Options are your way of giving a piece of your company so that when you're worth $1 billion, some of your early employees also become millionaires. And as you give out options, you also have to renew options to pay for more employees, to hire more employees. And so the pool gets depleted and you have to bring in more people. And so every time you're building the team, every time someone leaves and they have their shares vested, you might have a chunk in your company you need to rehire for. And then every time you raise money, that option pool gets depleted because of the dilution that impacts the entire pool. And so these are all things that you should be thinking about in terms of dilution of your company. But this talk was really meant to be about the founding of the company, and this is more over time. So I'll just jump over it. But I just do want to remind everyone that you have to take dilution. I've never seen a university startup be worth more than several $100 million in an exit that hasn't taken on a significant amount of capital. And so the dilution is real. And not only is it just dilution, you're losing control. And I've had a faculty at a talk like this stand up and say, "You mean if I raise money, I have to give up control?" have to give up decision making, and you do, but it's not a bad thing, and it's oftentimes a really good thing, because the future of the company isn't just about technology decisions. It's about go-to-market strategy decisions, product market fit decisions, and just being very introspective about where the company needs to go. And so you need to hire people, you need to bring in talent, and you need to do that. You need to take on dilution. I'm going to skip over this. It's just sort of how options are awarded and different buckets that they get put in. And these are different forms of options and shares that you may bring to founders and employees. And the key message to take away is that you should always build vesting into your equity plan. So I think I already mentioned that once. And if this doesn't make sense to you, I'll blame Lou. But Lou's been saying this, I think, for 20 years in his world of Lou Berneman, one of our founding partners. He came from the tech transfer world. You can either have a big piece of a small pie or a small piece of a big pie. I guarantee you a small piece of a big pie almost always is more valuable personally to the founders than a big piece of a small pie. So I also wanted to walk through a couple scenarios of how ownership plays out in an exit. And the reason why this is interesting is mostly because of some of the financial engineering that goes on in venture and startups that raise capital. And so the example here is a company, Startup Z, that is taking on money. And at the end, for a couple rounds, I'm going to show you two different exit scenarios, one upside, one downside. And it gets into some of the important terms I mentioned earlier. But so this company is raising a $5 million seed round at a $10 million pre. And so the dilution they suffer is 33%. And so you see that here, where over on the left, there's 0% for investors. And the rest of the company is between the founders, the co-founder and CEO, the structure I've laid out to you before. The dilution is an investor is buying 33% of the company, 5 on 15, as we say, and everyone else gets crammed down. And so if you were the founding CEO, your 40% goes to 27%. At the next round, you raise 15 million on a 45 pre. Investors have bought new investors have bought 25% of your company. The previous investors from the seed also get diluted. So that altogether, the previous investment and then the new investment totals 50% of your company. So after your Series A, 50% of your company is no longer owned by the founders of the company. And so this is where decisions matter. And so you'll find that this is the shifting of decisions from employees to the VCs. And it's okay, because if you exit for a $250 million exit, everyone's really happy. There's plenty of money to go around, and it's a life-changing event for a lot of the founders of the company and the employees involved, and that's great. But watch out, because if you don't have a fantastic exit, there's something called a preference stack. And the preference stack is simply described as investors get their money first. So they get their money back first. And oftentimes, there's a value of the company at which it doesn't matter to them whether it's a $20 million acquisition or a $35 million acquisition, because of this language around the participating preferred I described earlier. But what happens here is, instead of them getting the equal distribution of the total exit value, in this case, the 250 million, where they get 50% of it, investors actually get their money back first. And then they also can participate in the remainder. That's what the participating preferred is. So they get 50%, way more than 50%. They get their 20 million that they invested in first back, and they also get the 50% of the remainder. And so you can see that this is, not as successful as you would have hoped, given a $25 million acquisition number, and it's not life-changing. And for investors, it's not life-changing either. This is actually not a great return for a venture investor who was hopefully going to be generating a 5 to 10x return on the 20 million they put in. So ultimately, no one's happy here, but the investor's downside protection is better. And so this happens. It's part of the industry, and it's you put your capital at risk, and sometimes the capital is considered, since you have more, since the investors kind of have more control in terms of, or just more pull, more they're in the control seat, this is the way it works because people need money. But we wouldn't be able to build a lot of value out of our investment if it wasn't for you all that are putting the blood, sweat, and tears in the company. So it's a tough part of the game. One of the questions that came in is, could you cover how equity ownership impacts board voting rights? It does. And there's very few board votes where people are raising their hand. What you're talking about are some of the voting thresholds that go into a business. So in general, there's two classes of voting. There's preferred voting, where the investors are voting all together, and that is less sensitive to the valuation of a company. But when everyone is voting together, including the common shareholders, which for the most part are the founders of the company, then sometimes it's done on a percentage of ownership, and so a total percentage of ownership. And we always try and set up our term sheets or our legal structures in our companies so that no single entity can really control the vote. That's really what you want. And so even when a very big investor comes in and they're investing such that they might own 20-25% of your company, we would make sure that the voting thresholds were 70%, so that they couldn't drive all decisions with just their vote alone. And so those are the things you have to think about when you're investing, and when you're setting up your voting thresholds. So I think this is the last slide. Really, I think the takeaways that I always like to describe are, be prepared to suffer through dilution, and but also be excited about what it brings in and the advice that you get from the people that are giving you capital, and for the employees that you're bringing in. Sometimes the first employees who may have just started as a master's student that came out of your lab grow to be the VPs of engineering, who you can see really blossom in the role from a student to an executive. And some of the investors that are involved are very active with the company. Like some companies I'm speaking to once a week, because we're just a different ear. And when your C-suite is only 2 or 3 people, you need to have someone else to talk to. And so that comes through some of the investors you may work with, and it may come through some of the advisors you bring into the company, which you can incentivize with options also. So the short of it is, very little help comes without dilution, and so be prepared for dilution. And key terms to pay attention to in the earliest days of your company: think about liquidation preferences and participating and non-participating preferred. Make sure everyone's vesting, and always be aware of how some of these terms stack. And so don't let strange terms into your deal if you don't think that they're appropriate, and just keep in mind that they may exist forever if you do. So, lawyers are getting much better at advising companies. And so sometimes if you want someone to just kind of ask, like, is this standard? You should go to your lawyer team. But also, Tom's aware of plenty of these terms also, and he can let you know. And even if we're not investing in your company, we're always happy to take a look and just walk you through some of the terms you don't realize, just because we like to be a friendly VC for any of the universities we work with. So I'll stop there. But I'll mention one last thing. So, every time we create a term sheet or we invest and we're setting the terms for our investment, we're doing the math. Whether we're setting a really high pre-money valuation for you because you are a very hot startup, we have a multiple in mind. We have an investment we're making today, and there's what we want to get paid out in the end. And so if we give you a valuation and you're disappointed with it, and you somehow get us to increase it 20-30%, you better be sure that we're doing the engineering on the back end to see what other terms we can put in to recover some of that capital. We don't always get them, but make sure you do the math. And I'd really suggest that startups really do the same thing, and they don't just drive for the best valuation they can. They think about the whole story. And then tech transfer offices also have to be aware of this too, because they're dealing with startups who are raising an unknown amount of capital. And so we have helped them get through the dilution analyses and coming up with cap table scenarios. So that's all
Manny,
I had.
I just want to kind of highlight one of the points, one of your points earlier, as well as one of the key takeaways. Not just that equity is going to happen for early stage CEOs and founders, but the importance that you highlight on capital efficiency, right? And being able to set realistic milestones, execute to hit them, and to raise appropriately sized rounds. So yes, that's going, you're going to take that dilution hit, but if you're able to execute effectively and efficiently, you will still get that small portion that you need.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought I had this slide in here. Did I skip over it? I may have skipped over this. The capital that you are going to be able to, that you need for your company is a function of time, salaries, what it costs to run your different businesses, and then how much CapEx you need to buy. Valuation is some mysterious unknown function that we investors come up with that's based on how much traction you have, how you've been executing on your product development, your team's experience, and the market you're going after. And dilution is simply the division of those two numbers. And so if you want to think of being capital efficient, you are driving the amount of capital that you need down to increase your valuation. And so that's really where you should be focusing. And our fund is particularly keen on that. Like we have an East Coast mindset, despite investing across the country, we really like scrappiness. So we use that term a lot. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Tom. I can work through a couple of these questions, Tom. Should I do that?
Yes, we have about 6 minutes left. That'd be great.
Sure. So talk about down rounds and their impact on various levels. I'll say what I think you mean by levels, but I don't quite know if I'm going to have the right assumption. I think of levels as maybe different employee levels or ownership levels. Down rounds affect everybody. So a down round is, I will come over here to this scenario where the Series A was an up round. An up round is when your pre-money of your next round is above the post-money of your last round. A down round would have been the opposite. So a down round would have been if the pre-money was $10 million instead of 15. And so in that scenario, the previous you just did a different dilution calculation. So everyone's getting crushed in that scenario. And as investors in the seed round, you will be sitting at less than 1x your investment in terms of paper value. So it's not a good situation, but companies recover from it. Another question is typical profile for a founding CEO. I'll just take that as written, like a true founding CEO of someone who is not coming out of the lab, is not necessarily the charismatic grad student or professor that has some CEO qualities, but like a true founding CEO. Oftentimes at the earliest days of a company, when no one's going to get their Steve Jobs, but sometimes there are business experienced industry engineers and business people that do come around companies. And the most quality attribute we typically encounter is someone that's more of like a product mind. So someone that is able to hear what customers need. These are all technology companies that I expect you all to be starting. So it really is someone who can digest customer input, has a little bit of a technical background so that they can really understand if we build it this way, people will buy it. And that's the hardest part of any university startup. There's no shortage of like big markets for people to go after, but building the right product that can actually be sold into that market is the difficult part. And so we really like that. But obviously other important features are things like they've been involved in a successful startup. They've raised capital before. And the simplest way I describe it is the best CEO is someone who's made venture capitalists money before. Like that's the best quality you could ever have. Another question is, can you share some of the ways you guarantee your return if we want to increase our valuation by 20%? I cannot. So I think for that, I think it's some things that Tom mentioned: execute, build a great team, and be transparent. If I'm understanding that question correctly.
And I think a lot of that is also sector dependent, right? There's different ways to increase value based on how you're de-risking your own company, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd say, with hardware, it's difficult because it's hard to build revenue generating customer contracts within your first couple of years. And so we really look for building a strong visionary product that can open up our mind into what could become. But even if you can't necessarily get revenue generating contracts, generating interest. So after your seed round, let's say, by your Series A, you really do want to be able to show that you have customer interest, and that come in the form of pilots. They come in the form of revenue generating contracts. It could come in strategic investments, but I'd also say 20% is not a great uptick, as depending on how much where you're starting from. But we do like to see, we always target when we invest a 2x increase, let's say, in its post-money valuation. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we get less, sometimes we get more. But if it was just 20%, I may have said to myself, well, maybe I should have waited. So that's that. Another question is, does the type of exit affect how founders and employees get their share of capital? It's a good question. It's probably very nuanced. When a company is acquired by another company, there's a couple things that happen. So they often build incentives for the employees to stay, and they also sometimes will also sort of announce an exit, let's say a purchase of $500 million, but 200 million of that is actually what's upfront, and then there might be a 300 million milestone payout plan. And so those are the things to pay attention to. There's lots of strings that they can do on it. In IPOs, oftentimes there are guardrails on what key employees and key executives can do to liquidate their shares, and so it definitely is different depending on whether it's a buyout or an IPO.
Unfortunately, we are at the hour. So I know that there's a few unanswered questions, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and sincerely wanted to thank Manny for joining us on covering such a hot button topic as founders equity. So a big thank you. And for those of you in the audience, I encourage you to join us for the rest of our boot camp. You can go to our website for more details. And we will be posting this video as well.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Manny.